Hey thinkers, today we're going to go a little bit deeper than we usually do and talk about emotions and how you can better manage or deal with them. Well, hello everyone. My name is Dr. Jason Wright and I actually have my PhD in general psychology, so I'm pretty well versed when it comes to teaching this particular topic. I've been teaching at the college level for about 7 years now. And this topic is always something of interest, not only to me, but to a lot of students because of the amount of emotions that a lot of students go through during the school experience, but not just in school, just in life in general. So I wanted to take some time today, and we're not going to dig deep into the theoretical positions or the construct of emotions itself. But we're just going to talk about some principles that I believe might help you in better diagnosing where your emotions might be coming from so that you can begin to start working on them and get to that healthier place that we all want to be. So the first thing that I want to discuss is that your physiological response, the emotions that you are actually feeling, they're pointing to something. What are they pointing to? Well, they're pointing to some source of conflict that has been developed over a certain period of time. It could be recent, it could be in the distant past. And part of the problem that we run into whenever we start attempting to address the emotions that we're having is that if it's farther back in time and we don't really have an understanding as to where the emotion that we're currently feeling is coming from, then it ends up creating some conflict in our ability to be able to better manage them. It will always be easier to address something that is familiar to us or that has just recently occurred than for something that is more in the distant past that has accumulated over time. Also, depending on the habits that you have whenever you are experiencing emotions, there's kind of this rule of psychology, and you've probably heard me say this before if you've watched any of the videos, but we get good at what we do. And when it comes to our emotional responses, the more we have a certain type of response, whether it's a favorable or unfavorable or positive or negative response, we're only going to get better at that. I always like to use the example of road rage, which is something that I had a while ago that I've had to work on, and it took me 10 years to really get past it. But if we take an example like that, then it's these moments on the road that somebody will do something that I don't agree with, and then I have a physiological response according to that situation that I'm in. Let's say that somebody says something to you and it triggers an anger response, or it triggers a sad response, or whatever is triggering, whatever the situation is that is happening, whatever is triggering, you're always going to have a response, and for a reason. And the reason is something that has been happening over a period of time. So emotional responses are never something new. They're always something that have been happening over a period of time. The second thing is that if you will actively pay attention to that physiological response that you're having, and then purposefully identify the trigger that's creating that response, that's going to give you some insight into what actually needs to be addressed. So again, if we were to take the example of the road rage, then the trigger would be somebody performing an action that I didn't agree with. And so if I wanted to control my response over time, I would have to purposefully be looking for those types of triggers, and when they happen, pay attention to the type of response that I'm having. So again, I'm just using the example of road rage here, which is something that a lot of people experience and struggle with, but this will relate to any emotional response. So being able to pay attention to the moments in which you're having that physiological response. And here's the thing, the metric is, what are you feeling? If you start to feel sadness, if you start to feel anger, if you start to feel anxiety, whatever it is that emotional response is that you're having, that is always pointing to the trigger, right? It's always pointing to something that is happening that's causing that response. And that leads us to the third thing, which is be able to assess the degree of your response according to the value of the trigger. So let's go back to the road rage example. If somebody cuts me off and I have a heightened level of an anger response, if I actually compare the two things together, does that person cutting me off, which is something that I've been guilty of in the past and is just something that people will do from time to time, and some people are going to be rude about it. Some people it's based out of a necessity. They kind of need to do it in order to get into that space so that they're not in a position that they're in. Whatever the reason for them cutting you off, does it merit you having the size of response that you are having? So again, let's use a different example. Let's say somebody says something to you, and this person is somebody that you care about, and it hurts your feelings, and it cuts a little bit deep. Sometimes you're going to have an emotional response that is actually appropriate to what it is that has happened, right? So we're not saying today that you should just get to a point to where you're no longer experiencing emotions, but it is important for you to be able to assess the degree of your response according to the actual value of the trigger. If the trigger itself is something that is low, that should not actually, trigger a response that is high, then understanding that these types of things down here should not be getting these kinds of responses is important to understand. So the fourth thing is that you need to determine the response that you want to have whenever certain triggers occur, and then set a narrative for that. So what do I mean by that? So let's go back to what we were saying, and let's say that this trigger is creating this kind of response. But I'm going to create a narrative, a more positive narrative that says when these types of triggers happen, whenever I start experiencing a rise in my emotional response, I'm going to speak the narrative that I have established so that I can start decreasing the level of that response purposefully. I have to intentionally address the response in real time so that I can get to the point to where over time, my response to this trigger is going to get less and less. So let's say that my current response is up here and I start setting the narrative. Well, the next time this happens, it's not like this, I'm just going to hop down to here the second time, right? We're hoping that if it was here the first time and we start speaking the narrative, that it's just going to move down at least a little bit. And then every time this happens, the more we speak that positive narrative, the more we convince ourselves that we don't want to respond that way, we're going to see this response get lower and lower and lower and lower. The fifth thing is something that we've already kind of hinted at, but when the triggers hit, speak the narrative. And not just to yourself here, but speak it out loud. Now, I want to be clear here and say this, that if you're in a group of people, then I probably wouldn't say just start speaking it out, because you might put yourself into an awkward position. But if you're in a place or an environment in which you can actually speak it out loud, then go ahead and speak it out loud. But if the situation only allows for you to say it here, this is at least the minimum that you should do, right? So, what is the trigger? What is the response? What is the narrative that you want to speak whenever this trigger is hitting? And the more that you speak it here and then here, right, the better you're going to get at responding in the way that you want to respond. I want to be careful here because I don't want to make it sound like this is a simple process, because my experience has taught me that it's far from simple to conquer emotions in a positive way. Again, I mentioned in the beginning, we've gotten really good at the way that we've been responding. And we might need to look at it in a way in which if my response is way up here, according to whatever the trigger is, then it's going to take me more time to get to that desired place than it is going to be a little time. Here's something that I want to say from an encouraging standpoint, though. My experience has taught me that, and this is in my own life, that the more that I've targeted certain responses, the more that I've seen myself have lesser responses kind of across the board. What we're really focusing on today is those everyday type of experiences that you're having in which your emotions are constantly fluctuating. And the result is that you are having more stress that you really don't want. And so your desire is to live in a more neutral emotional state and not be experiencing so many of the negative emotions that you are. Remember, getting to this place is going to take time. And also, you're going to have to learn how to develop those skills of identifying the triggers, setting the narrative for the type of response that you want to have, and actively combating, right? Going to war against that internal conflict. It is a battle. It is a war. I wouldn't want to look at it any other way because it might be the biggest battle that some of us face in our lives, that internal conflict that we're having. So, again, this is a very deep type of discussion, and we could definitely talk more about this, and I will in the future. But I wanted to just address those 5 principles to give you at least a few action steps that you can start taking in order to go from where you're at regarding certain emotion or emotional responses to certain triggers so that you can start establishing a way of addressing those. I hope this helps. If it did, I would really encourage you to leave some comments, or if you have other questions about this, leave a question in the comments section. Also, again, as usual, subscribe to the channel so that you can receive updates whenever we post videos each Thursday. And if you will, share it with your friends. I say this a lot, but this might be the single most common thing that students struggle with, and that is their emotional responses and the emotional conflict that they experience while being a student. So subscribe, share, and then make sure that you come back and visit every week so that you can keep boosting your skills as a student. That's what we're all about, learning, developing, and growing. I'm Dr. Jason Wright with Think It Clear, and I'll see you next time.